Laura, thank you very much. Oh, Laura, thank you very much, and big thanks to the Catalog for Philanthropy. I'm excited to get to be here today and talk about some of my favorite things. And of course, thank you to everybody who's on the call today for wanting to serve your nonprofits and your missions better. So a little bit more about me. I'm Sean Hale. I've been doing nonprofit nuts and bolts for more than 20 years now. Most recently, I spent 4 years at a capacity building nonprofit here where I'm based in Austin, Texas, as the Chief Financial and Operations Officer. But these days, I'm an independent consultant, and my specialty is helping nonprofit administrative functions and getting those to work stronger. So, and really what I'd like to do is all the parts of that back office, whatever it takes so that the rest of this, so the admin staff can get their job done, get it done well, and the rest of the organization can really focus on the mission. Because at the end of the day, it's about the mission, but we need the administrative functions to work well so that the mission can happen well, right? So today during this webinar, we are going to identify ways that your nonprofit can save money. We're going to identify ways that your nonprofit can free up time, because most of us have a long list of things to do that we don't ever have enough time to do. We are going to help to get to a better understanding of how we can engage our board and our staff in the finances so they can really participate in those conversations. And we're also going to start to think about how the back office processes have an impact on justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. So here's the quick agenda. We're going to have 6 different points today. Please do feel free if you have questions or comments or anything else like that. Please drop those into the chat. Laura's going to be keeping an eye on that, and she'll be stopping me so we can stop and discuss anything that wasn't clear or otherwise. The presentation is going to take about 25-ish minutes, and then we'll also have a big time at the end for Q&A. So before I jump in and we start talking about those specific topics, I please just wanted to ask you to not sue me. What I'm going to be doing today is providing a lot of good general information, but each organization is unique, and each organization would apply these different things that we're going to be talking about in different ways according to their own specific situations. For example, if I said, hey, having a margarita machine in the office on Fridays could be a great boost for staff morale, that might be true for most organizations, but there are some organizations where it might backfire, like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, right? So anyway, let's go ahead and dive in. Tip number 1 is about hidden savings. And in my experience, and with all the nonprofits I've worked with over the last 20 some odd years, I've seen that there are quite literally thousands of ways to save money. Pretty much every nonprofit can, and they can do it in a way that isn't about belt tightening. It isn't about discomfort. It's about there are hidden savings that people didn't even know were there, and they can put into place painlessly. So let's talk about just one example today, the lazy vendor. Last year, I got to work with a great nonprofit in San Antonio, smart people, really tech forward, really serious about automation and about working smarter rather than harder. But these folks, as smart and as hardworking as they were, they had a blind spot. And that was their technology vendors, specifically the folks that were helping them with Salesforce. And the nicest thing I can say about this vendor is that they were a sloth. They're overpriced, had a very slow response. And in fact, they've managed to develop a reputation for themselves as providing terrible service to small and medium nonprofits. So I helped these folks connect to a more responsive vendor. They were able to get about $12,000 a year in savings, and for the same package of service, and actually get better, more attentive service, quick response times, those sorts of things. And this is a vendor who's actually trusted by a lot of small and medium-sized nonprofits here in the region. So one of the questions for you that I hope you take back with you today is, where are you with your vendors? And certainly any contract over $10,000, you should be reviewing that every few years anyway, just as a best practice. And by reviewing it, I mean like getting a couple of competing bids just to, get a fresh idea of what's going on out there. But you should do that sooner if you have any vendors who are lazy or unresponsive, or that you're kind of just not satisfied with, because there is a big potential payoff to shopping those contracts. Tip number 2 is getting the right tool for the job. So the Swiss Army knife. That's a tool, right? It's a pretty cool tool. When I was a kid growing up, we would go to the mall because I'm of a generation of people who actually did shopping in malls. And we would go to the mall, and I always wanted to go by the store that was selling the Swiss Army knives because they were just so cool for my 8-year-old brain, right? And I especially loved the ones that have like 100 different blades in them, right? Because you could do literally just about anything with a knife like that. You could even chop down a tree, of course, because there's a saw attachment. And I bet if somebody really wanted to, they could even make furniture, even though it would take a really, really long time, right? So everybody here on the call, I'm sure you know that if you want to make furniture, you probably want to have a woodworking kit, right? Rather than a Swiss Army knife to go about making a table and chairs. It's about having the right tool for the job. But nonprofits, sometimes it's not always as clear. For example, Quickbooks, it's a great bookkeeping tool, right? For small nonprofits and small businesses, it's #1 for good reason. They have really strong market share. They're actually like pretty user friendly, and you can get a good discount on QuickBooks through TechSoup. And just as important, it's pretty easy to find bookkeepers who are familiar with it. So that's a big deal, right? Well, QuickBooks, it's a great bookkeeping tool. It is not a good CRM, right? And it's not a good donor database. Nonetheless, I've had this happen to me 2 or 3 times now in my career where I'm having lunch with somebody who's doing this with somebody from a local nonprofit with good visibility, good organization, and come to find out over the course of lunch, they were using QuickBooks as their CRM, right? As their donor database. What that meant for them is that if they wanted to analyze giving, or if they wanted to even do a mailing or anything with that donor information, it would literally take them hours and hours to get the data out and get it into a form where they could go about doing their regular business instead of it taking like 2 minutes, which is what it does with a good CRM, right? So this nonprofit, consequently, they had no idea of things like touch points with major donors or moves management or any of those other basic fundraising fundamentals. They did have a workaround though. They hired another staff person, a whole additional staff person, and most of this person's job was just getting that data out of QuickBooks and making it usable. Pretty expensive workaround, right? And I don't mean to pick on these folks. They're actually really good, smart people. It's a good organization. They're doing good work. The people there, most of them have advanced degrees in the organization specialty, but nobody there had the kind of experience with nonprofit back office or with fundraising that would let them know that, like, yeah, this is kind of like using a Swiss Army knife to make furniture, right? Now, what did I do? I helped them connect to a professional who got them onto a real CRM. And so now they are a lot more productive with their fundraising efforts and their donor communication. They're able to do better, and they're able to do analysis, not just better analysis, but analysis. And they are able to engage their donors in a way that they couldn't before. So my question for you today is, do you have all the right tools at your nonprofit? Are you sure? And how would you know for sure? Tip number 3, time is money. And I do not want to suggest that you bring a stopwatch to the office. We're not bringing a stopwatch to the office. We're not bringing in time cards if you don't have them already. We're not micromanaging the staff, right? None of those things are usually part of the secret sauce for a smaller, medium-sized nonprofit. Instead, what I want us to think about is about using our time wisely. Using our time wisely. What do I mean? Well, have you ever seen a nonprofit where the computers are held together with duct tape and a prayer? Have you ever seen a nonprofit that was only using free or super cheap software, even when better stuff was out there? Have you ever seen a nonprofit where everybody had to train themselves on the software, and so they would muddle along instead of ever really mastering the use of it or getting like the full use and the power out of that software? Have you ever seen a nonprofit where they were using dozens of little systems, even when there were good integrated solutions that worked together and let the data flow back and forth easily? Have you ever seen a nonprofit with DIY tech support? Just for fun, we're going to do a little survey with everybody. So I'm going to stop the screen share, And I'm going to ask, we're going to do a quick vote by using our videos on our Zooms. And so everybody, I want you to stop your video for just a second. So turn off your video. And because what we're going to do is we're going to vote by turning our video back on. So everybody, please turn off your video real quick. And here is the question for you. Here's the question. Have you ever seen one of those things, like the computer with duct tape, or the organization that was using a dozen different pieces of software when they could have used one? Any of those problems that I just mentioned, if you've seen those before, flip your video back on, please. Flip your video back on if you've ever seen one of those things. Oh my gosh, just saw a lot of people turn their video back on. Thank you for helping me prove my point. That's very kind of you. I'm going to go back to our regularly scheduled presentation now. So folks, this is a common problem in the nonprofit world. It is a very common problem. That doesn't make it okay just because it's common though, right? And fortunately, this is very solvable, right? I've tackled this one before. Let me tell you another story about a nonprofit I got to work with. Great organization, smart staff, a blue ribbon board of directors, lots of community respect, big impact in the community. Everybody on staff had these laptops that had gotten donated to them from a grant maker. The grant maker said, you know, we're going to get new equipment for all of our staff because this isn't good enough for our staff anymore. But hey, nonprofit, would you like to use this? And the nonprofit said, yes, of course, we would like that. So I got to go work with these folks a few years after they'd gotten that donation from the grant maker. And so by that time, the laptops they were using wouldn't hold a charge, needed constant tech support. They were slow. They needed rebooting all the darn time. Maybe you guys have seen this also. PS, giving that kind of equipment to your staff, that sends a message to them about how much you value their time. And that really, it creates a morale problem, which is not exactly good for delivering on your mission if your staff have a morale problem, right? So I help them to connect the dots, right? To figure out the lost productivity from that equipment, right? They weren't getting a bill every month for that, but staff were losing time on that. And so just by using conservative estimates, we were able to figure out that they were losing $1,500 every year for every employee in lost productivity. But the staff person was sitting there waiting for it to reboot or was moving slowly, all that kind of stuff. If we compare that to new equipment, brand new laptop, it's going to pay for itself in 6 months, right? It's going to last between 2 and 5 years. And PS, that's a whole lot better for morale, right? That sends a really good signal to your staff about how much you value them and their time. And folks, please don't beat yourself up if your particular nonprofit that you serve is in this trap right now. Please don't beat yourself up, because the message that we get constantly from all sides is that we are expected to martyr ourselves and that we're expected to save money, and that we're supposed to save money in exactly those ways, like putting off those expenses. The good news is that the fix to that kind of problem will often pay for itself very, very quickly. That is the good news, and chances are just about every nonprofit has one or more solutions that are going to pay for themselves very quickly. Tip number 4 today is outsourcing. And if you're getting awesome results out of your back office and your administrative staff right now, and everybody in the back office, your administrative staff, they're all happy, everything is, 5 stars every day, all the time, this is a great time to go refill your coffee. If that's not necessarily the case, I want to put another option out there for you to consider, which is outsourcing, because many, many nonprofits are not getting great results out of their back office. Very often that's because their administrative staff have to wear too many hats, right? And so the staffers, they're constantly changing gears between different duties and different skill sets. Many, many nonprofit administrators constantly live on the edge of burnout. I've seen this over and over again throughout my career. When you're on the edge of burnout, your performance goes down, your morale goes down, your creativity and ability to problem solve doesn't do too well either. And when you're in that situation, as competent as you might be, as smart, as hardworking, as dedicated to the mission as you might be, it can be really hard to stay up to date with best practices, right? So staying up with technology, I want to acknowledge that's not for everybody. In fact, there's some nonprofits where avoiding technology might be core to the mission, like the Old Order Amish Helping Program, right? They really are intentionally sticking with the horse and buggy, even though if they went and bought a Honda, they could get from point A to point B faster. But they have a missional reason to stick with the horse and buggy. Most nonprofits, though, we should aspire to keep up with technology, right? And to use it in ways that are going to let us to serve the mission better. But the common dilemma for nonprofit administrators that I've seen myself personally, I've lived it and I've seen it in so many of my colleagues, is that we can't stay current when we're on the edge of burnout, right? Many nonprofit administrators, I would say most of us, we work long, intense hours just to cover the day-to-day routine because we're switching hats all the time, especially in a small nonprofit. We're wearing the bookkeeping hat for an hour, then HR for 15 minutes, then something breaks with somebody's computer or the internet, and so we're fixing that too. And we have to be the greeter because somebody just came in the door. And by the way, somebody's out of copy paper and we need to take care of that, and dozens of other things over the course of any given week. How can we stay up on trends in a dozen different fields anyway, right? That's hard enough to stay up on trends in one field, much less when you're split between a dozen different fields. So most administrators, they don't have the time or the energy to stay up on best practices, especially when they're burned out. So I have another little story for you, and I've seen this many times before. So, and in fact, I'm working with a client with us on this right now. They had an office manager who was with the organization for about 20 years. Staffing, the admin staffing did not grow with the organization or grow with the responsibilities that she was asked to take on. And so she certainly wasn't able to keep up with technology. Reports every year got later and later, and they were incomplete. There were significant errors. Taxes were going unpaid. Other important things in this, the day-to-day administration, were not getting done. The whole situation, of course, was not good for her morale. Supervisor was not impressed with her performance. The supervisor wasn't connecting the dots. And then she suddenly retired at the end of 2020. And of course, she hadn't had time to train anybody or document her work. She was just like, I can't take it anymore. I'm out of here. So how are we helping this nonprofit to get back on track? Well, we're splitting up the functions. There was too much on that one person's plate, no matter how dedicated, smart, hardworking she was, just too much. And so splitting up the duties. Office manager, general administrative duties, those are staying in-house with the organization. But the bookkeeping function, we're helping them get that transitioned over to a third party, right? A professional firm that only does one thing. All they do is help nonprofits with QuickBooks online. They do one thing, kind of like, well, you guys are in DC, so kind of like Five Guys, right? You can get a hamburger there. They do that one thing, they do it well. And what we're also doing with this nonprofit is we're adding in key functions that the organization has never had before in the form of strategic financial advice, right? Can't afford a full-time CFO. They don't need a full-time CFO, but just 10 to 20 hours a month is bringing in high-level analysis and skills to help interpret those financial reports, provide strategic thought partnership to the executive director and the board, and helping them think through how do they manage the budget better, how do they work through the audit, and those other strategic questions that you want from a CFO, but you can't, you don't want or need or can't afford to have full time. And folks, this is not about asking your administrator to be a jack of all trades and do them well, right? This is kind of about the opposite. This is about how can we, if your organization is in that Amish wagon kind of situation, how can we help start moving it towards a Honda? Or another way of thinking about it is, how do we help your administrative staff move from this jack of all trades but master of none situation to a situation where they can do great work with a reasonable, manageable number of responsibilities? So if you are, as a nonprofit, ready to consider some outsourcing functions, I have a few more thoughts for you on that. Think about core job responsibilities rather than about an individual in the seat that they filled, right? It's not about finding an outsourced person that can, or outsourced service provider that can have one person do a dozen things. It's about what are those dozen things and what one or two or three functions might go well to an outsourced person who is only responsible for one thing, and that's all they do professionally, right? It's about accountability. and the ability to hold a staff person accountable when you know that you're asking them to do too much already, versus holding accountable a third party who they only have one job and that's what they do. They specialize in that 24/7. It's also about being able to terminate or replace if the work isn't satisfactory, right? That's so hard to do when you have an employee who you know you've been asking to do too much and do everything, versus having a third party who you've asked them to do one thing, and if they're not able to do it well, you can go and switch them out for somebody else who does that bookkeeping or that IT management or whatever it is that you need. And it's also about staying current with technology. And it's about the ability of an employee who does a dozen things to stay current versus the ability of a service provider who does just one thing to stay current with the relevant technology in that particular field. This is also about saving money. It's about reliability. It's about using your nonprofit's funds wisely. It's about keeping focus and attention on the mission, because when your back office runs well, everybody else can focus on the mission, and vice versa, right? When the back office isn't working well and your staff are worried about, am I going to get paid this month, or the light's going to come on, or you're having a nasty audit with the grantor because you didn't have the documentation in place, that's when everybody gets distracted, right? This is about better service at a better price. The executive director that we're working with on this particular transition reported that she anticipates saving about $15,000 a year because of this change. So getting better service overall and actually saving money. And the better service comes in the form of more timely reports, accurate reports, and strategic financial advice. One last note on all of this. Not all outsourced is necessarily good or better, right? You still need to check references. You still need to remain engaged and evaluate the service regularly, right? This isn't a set it and forget it kind of thing, but it can be much more satisfactory for everybody involved. Tip number 5, dashboard.
Wait,
So
Sean,
yes.
Sorry, I'm gonna interrupt you here. Someone just asked if you have a template or toolkit to easily calculate those lost dollars so that they wouldn't have to make one from scratch to make that argument to their leadership team.
It's not, well, I don't have like a handy ready to go toolkit. The short version is you talk to your staff and you find out how much time is going to waste, and then you start crunching the numbers. But I'd be happy to have that person follow up with me afterwards if they have any more particular questions about that. So it's not, I'm sorry, I don't have a tool built for that I'm sharing with folks, but that's the short version.
Great. I think that's all we have in the chat right now, but if anyone else has any questions, feel free to put them in, and I'll just read those out.
Okay, great. So for tip number 5, we're going to change gears a little bit. And we're going to talk about, instead of directly saving money, we're going to talk about ways to better engage our leadership, which, by the way, is going to be good for them getting engaged, being more productive, and or going out and, if it's like a fundraiser or a board member, being able to go out and get more money because they are more engaged. So last year, I learned a number that blew my socks off. It's the number 93. More specifically, 93% of American adults have math anxiety. 93%. That just blows me away. And so we have to ask ourselves the question, do our financial reports engage our board? Do they engage our management? Or are they causing anxiety with folks? And we have to ask ourselves, is it acceptable to only engage 1 out of every 14 leaders? Here's a little hint into my thinking on this. The board's number 1 job is their fiduciary responsibility. And I'm not sure they can do that if they're not engaged with the money. So right now you're seeing in front of you kind of a standard financial report, right? And very often it's a whole lot more lines, even for just the revenue side of things, than these 6 lines that you're seeing in front of you right now. Kind of a standard way that we've been taught and that we've inherited for presenting the information. And then we ask the staff and the board members, like, all right, we need to make some big decisions here, right? We need to, make some big, tough decisions. Isn't this a whole lot better? If we wanted to have a conversation with our board about whether or not to cancel the annual gala and the financial impact that could have on the organization, what would you rather have that 93% of the board looking at? Pie chart or that, right? And these graphics, they helped us to engage everybody else in the room, the people for whom, the numbers aren't dancing in pretty beautiful, marvelous ways. A good financial dashboard, it's going to have 6 to 10 graphics on 1 or 2 sheets of paper. And it's going to be the same graphics pretty much every time that are going to help to tell the story that doesn't just jump out of the numbers for most of us, right? And folks, I want to make clear here that this doesn't replace the traditional financial reports. Those still need to be there, but it supplements them, right? It gives a way for the other 93% of people to engage with that information and to understand the key measures of financial health for the organization so that you can have everybody really engaged in those key financial strategic decisions, even if they aren't, best buddies with the numbers. Like here's a cash projection, right? That could have been put in front of an organization at budget time, put in front of the board. Digesting that as numbers can be difficult, but looking at this, you can see, all right, there's the projection for the current year, and it shows us going down Q1, Q2. And I can see a board member saying, hey, I totally get why we might expect cash to go down for the first 2 quarters, but let's talk about the, Q3 and Q4, the second half of the year. What are the assumptions that are going into those optimistic projections on cash? And even if that person is not a numbers person, they can bring wisdom, their perspective, and good questions to the table that need to be there and need to be part of the conversation. Graphics like these also help to improve the organization's focus on what's most important. I won't do another quiz again, but I bet we've all been in a board meeting where time might have gotten wasted on something insignificant in the financial reports, right? I can tell you, I hate wasting time going down rabbit holes. And it does happen all that often, and it can happen when you have just too much information in front of people. It's hard for them to know what's important and what isn't. So in the graphic that you have in front of you right now on program profitability, this is for an imaginary nonprofit that does work around 4 different kinds of animals, right? Cats and dogs and fish and horses. And of course, everybody loves the horse program. They're beautiful, majestic animals, yada, yada, yada. It's great. But if the organization is going into tough budget times, is there a different program that we should be talking about perhaps? Not to poo-poo the fishes, right? They're lovely animals as well. But if we're losing money with that program, that might be the first place for us to have a conversation rather than talking about the horses or the dogs or the cats. And folks, dashboards, they're not for big nonprofits anymore. Lots and lots of small and medium-sized nonprofits are getting dashboards built, whether it's with in-house talent in the staff, or they're getting fractional CFO services to help them build that out, right? And it's amazing what a little bit of professional financial advice can do to help an organization analyze its finances, get them presented in a way that can engage people, and help the organization make more strategic decisions around the real information. Last tip for
Sean, I'm gonna interrupt you before we get to the last tip. There are 2 questions here. The first one is, do you also consider outsourcing like marketing functions? Marketing and social media has gotten so complicated that generalist program staff can have trouble keeping up.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that might be, for some organizations, it might be, yeah, we just want to have this outsourced forever, right? Or at least for the immediate future, right? On an ongoing basis, or at a minimum like that, because you might have somebody on the staff who still loves it, still has a passion for it, but hasn't been able to keep up with it. And so at least getting somebody in there to help them kind of look at what they're doing and make sure that they're up to date on all the current trends and kind of like a tune-up. So that would be another option, is to get a good third party in there to do a tune-up. But that's an excellent function that's easy to outsource. That is, bookkeeping is one where you can find good professionals who specialize in the specific nonprofit needs for bookkeeping or for marketing and communications. Another one that I've seen a lot of is managed IT. And actually that's, of all of them, that's one of the biggest, because it's just, there's so much cyber crime out there, and you don't want to have all your data stolen or get locked out of it. And bring in somebody who can cover that gamut of services, where they, on their staff, they have somebody who can help you with the cybersecurity, help you with computer repairs, and keep the software all updated and running well. And that when somebody's machine goes down, they can either fix it in 10 minutes or have a different machine in your staff person's hands so that they don't have any unnecessary downtime. What was the other question?
So the other question is, in very small nonprofits, staff members often wear multiple hats because there isn't enough money available to fully staff up or outsource. Do you have any recommendations for turning those soft cost savings, such as lost productivity, into hard savings that would help pay for an outsourced service?
Yeah, sometimes that's the best way to go about this, right? Is like, you don't try and eat the whole elephant at once, right? You eat it one bite at a time. And so the first bite might be going after those, where might we have those hidden savings, that first tip that we covered, right? Where we're spending money without even knowing that we can get the same thing somewhere else for half of what we're paying. And maybe even get better service and get it for half of what we were paying. And so it's like shopping the vendors, that sort of thing can sometimes produce really good results. Third parties can help with that sometimes, but that's also something you can do in-house, but you got to free up the time to do that. And similarly with productivity might be, once you've kind of done everything that you can with the raw money savings, well, great. Now that you're saving $5 or $10 or $15 or $20,000 a year, which is not uncommon from the work that I've done with clients, then great. Well, rather than the next thing being to invest that in programs, how about we invest that in something else that's going to get us a good return, whether it's bringing in a third party to help us do some more analysis on other things, or if you have those duct tape and bubblegum computers, maybe your next step is getting those computers so that all of your staff are able to get 3 hours more worth of work done in the same amount of time, right? Just by virtue of getting that new equipment in there. So it's by taking it kind of one bite at a time, you can get there. Anything else for now?
No, that's it for now. Thanks, Sean.
Okay, these are great questions. And I can tell more stories about hidden savings. There's another one I love telling about a van, if you guys want to hear it at the end. So tip number 6 has to do with justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I certainly hope if you didn't understand this before last year, that over the course of the last 12, 16 months, that the importance of this has become important for you and your organization. And folks, I'm not an expert in justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, but I do want to share something with you that I've learned that you can apply at your nonprofit. Because yes, it does turn out that what happens in a nonprofit's back office in the administrative functions can have a very meaningful impact in this area. And just because our administrative staff, we're working with numbers and we have good hearts and good intentions, that doesn't mean that our actions can't have an impact in this area. And in fact, just about every nonprofit has opportunities for improvement in the way their back office functions have ripple effects throughout the organization, outside the organization, when it comes to justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. So we're just going to cover one example today, and that's expense reimbursements, right? And you might be wondering, well, that sounds kind of innocent. And so what's going on there? Well, with expense reimbursements, what we have going on is an employee is paying for expenses on the employer's behalf, right, out of their own pocket, and then the employer pays them back. Sometimes that's a small expense, like a cup of coffee with a client, or it's mileage for them going back and forth to visit the client. Sometimes it's something large, like it's travel expenses, right? Airplane tickets, hotel to go to that convention, that conference, that special training. So the employee, they do that. Sometimes it's even direct expenses on behalf of the organization, right? They go out and they're buying a new computer for the organization, or pencils, or copy paper, or whatever. So the employee, they have those expenses, they save them up to the end of the month, or even the same day sometimes if the organization allows it. And they fill out a big form, it says all the stuff that they needed, they staple all their receipts to it, they turn it into the accounting department. Sometimes the accounting department's able to pay them back in a week, sometimes it takes longer. And folks, I don't want to beat up anybody on this. Personally, this was my default for many years as a nonprofit administrator, and I thought that this was a pretty darn good policy. I didn't see for a long time any reason to change this. But now I know, and I hope all of us, if you didn't know before this call, that you will know by the end of this call that we can do better and we should do better when it comes to employee reimbursement. And the good news is that new technology makes a much more inclusive policy around these kinds of expenses. It makes that kind of policy a whole lot easier. So let's do a little bit of compare and contrast between a reimbursement policy versus having credit or debit cards available to your staff. With a reimbursement policy, The employer, it's basically borrowing money from the employee. That's troubling because there's a power imbalance there, right? Who has more power in that situation? And that entity with more power, the nonprofit, is asking the employee to give them a loan. Seems kind of backwards. Versus credit or debit cards, right? Where the organization is paying its bills directly. That seems reasonable, right? With a reimbursement policy, it disadvantages your staff who are from poor and historically marginalized communities. Versus a credit or debit card, which is fair for everybody. Why do I say that a reimbursement policy disadvantages your staff from poor and historically marginalized communities? Well, it's none of our business. We shouldn't be knowing. Sometimes we know accidentally, but most of the time we don't know who in the organization is under financial stress, right? Versus who might have a bank account with $50,000 just sitting in there doing nothing, right? We don't know who's financially strained. I do know, this is another stat I learned last year, 80% of Americans live from paycheck to paycheck. 80% of Americans live from paycheck to paycheck. And so we're asking those people to cut us a loan to our organization. And we don't know who in our organization has ever declared bankruptcy, right? It's none of our business. But if you've ever declared bankruptcy, chances are you can't even get a credit card to be able to be able to float this loan to your employer, right? So this policy of reimbursement, it can create a situation where these staff people end up feeling shame and embarrassment because of their personal finances, even though that's really none of the organization's business and should not come into play in the unemployment situation. If you have a credit or debit card available for them, that empowers them and it shows trust in them. So ultimately, we have a situation where the reimbursement policy, it discriminates and it excludes. Why do I say it discriminates and excludes? Well, if that employee isn't in a position to give a loan to their employer, what do? And besides feel shame and embarrassment. How many of them are going to skip that conference or that professional development opportunity because they cannot front the money to do that? How many of them are going to decline a promotion because they know that with that promotion comes a responsibility that they cannot fulfill because they don't have a credit card and they can't float a loan to their employer? And then which employees, what is the socioeconomic profile of the employees who are most likely to end up getting excluded? So let's compare that to a credit or debit card for those staff, which welcomes them and engages them. And it tells them, we don't care about how much money you have in your bank, right? We're glad you're here. We want you to do your job. We want you to be able to do it without having any shame or embarrassment for doing a routine job duty. So the good news, 20 years ago, the kind of thing I'm going to tell you about would have been a whole lot of work for your back office staff who we want to get less work on their plates, right? But these days, there are some great options out there that make it pretty easy to automate the kinds of things that we're talking about and really make it fairly quick and easy. There are options out there. One of my favorites will get you a free credit card, not just one free credit card, but a free credit card for everybody that wants them. If you want to have 50 credit cards, super cool. And you can also create virtual credit cards, right? That's one where they never print the card, but you need one because you want to have a dedicated credit card for your TechSoup membership, because for some reason, for 100 different reasons, you want to have a dedicated virtual card for that, so that when that staff position changes out or you don't need to worry about that number bouncing. So you can create a virtual credit card and dedicate it just to that vendor. You have easy to control budgets and limits. So whoever's administering these credit cards, they can go in and, like normally, let's say Terry has just a, $50 a month budget because they go out to coffee 3 times a month with clients, right? Well, but they're going to go to a conference next month. And so, all right, we're going to bump up their budget to $1,000. It's going to be just for 1 month. It'll automatically go down to 50 at the end of the month. Bang, that took 3 minutes to go log into the system and make that change. And the particular tool I'm thinking about, and there are multiple tools out there that are going to help you with this. The one I'm thinking about has a free built-in expense report tool. So instead of having, to have your bookkeeper go chase down your staff at the end of the month, and you have that tension and that sometimes hostility between the different departments because both of them are trying to get their job done and they don't want to fiddle with expense reports, but they have to because they need those receipts. So here's what the new system looks like. Terry goes out to coffee with a client. They buy the coffee. They get the receipt. They pull out their smartphone. Click, click, click. Pull up the app. Take a photo of the receipt. Code it to fundraising. Right in there, coffee with Pat, client. hit send, they're done. Now they can lose that receipt forever because it's already stored up in the cloud. And when at the end of the month, your bookkeeper or your administrator needs that, it's already there. And so the hostility, that unneeded tension, that chasing people down for receipts at the end of the month, it goes away. Fortunately, folks, this is a switch that's fairly easy to make. And there are a lot of things like that where there are just opportunities in the way we have our back office processes that can enhance justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in ways that we never imagined there was any impact before. So that's it. Let me give you a quick summary here. Vendor review, we talked about that first, right? So to find those hidden savings, the vendor review is one way to do that. Having the right tool for the job, right? Most organizations, they have at least one instance where somebody's using a Swiss Army knife that they really should be using a woodworking tool set with, right? They have a good tool, but it's not the right tool for the job. Remembering that time is money. And so what is your organization's computer and duct tape situation, and what can you do about that? And are you sure that you would even recognize them all? Because sometimes we live with, I'll tell you another story in a minute, perhaps, about the van, where sometimes we live with that pain for so long that we don't even know that, like, that's the wrong way to do things. Outsourcing, right, is an option for us. Rather than asking our admin staff to be jacks of all trades and do a dozen things poorly and feel crummy about themselves, and the job doesn't necessarily get done well, and they're not staying up with trends, much less their just daily routine. Dashboards, right? How are we engaging the other 93% of our board and our organizational management? Because we want them at the table, right? We want their wisdom, their perspective, and they might not be speaking up because they aren't comfortable looking at the numbers and they don't want to be embarrassed. And similarly, thinking about credit and debit cards, again, avoiding shame and embarrassment for folks. How do we set up systems where it is welcoming and engaging for everybody? So it's just about time for Q&A, and just want to, we might not be able to cover all the questions and answers today, so please do feel free to reach out to me afterwards. I'm Sean Hale. You have my email address and my website on the screen, but for those of you who might be visually impaired, www.seanhale.org. And I love to help nonprofits with the whole back office, all the administrative functions, including the tips that we covered today, saving money, enhancing the back offices, finding ways to work smarter rather than harder, those fractional CFO services so you can get your folks more engaged and really get good financial analysis, and all the other stuff. So there we go. What other questions do you have? Or comments? What did I mess up? Do you disagree?
There are a few other questions here. Do you want me to read some of them out?
That'd be great.
Okay. Someone asked, can you talk about financial controls? I was in a financial management workshop yesterday where the facilitator was specifically advocating against everyone having credit cards.
Yeah, for some, there are different schools of thought on this, and I've gone back and forth. I have a colleague, Lewis, who, good person. I respect him a lot. I believe he's mistaken on this account. He happens to be highly conservative and highly risk averse. And so the way of doing things where it's kind of that comparison. You're going to have risk. Every organization is going to have risk, and you're not going to get away from it. The way Lewis is choosing for his organization to have risk is in a way that has those negative effects for the staff. If you do issue credit and debit cards for your staff, as I'm proposing, with the system that I'm talking about, and there are a number of them out there that will do this for you, I'm sure, you can turn the credit card on and off. So you can, even if you want to have tight controls, if you want to be really conservative, you can still get a credit card in everybody's name, but you have one person controlling them, and they still need to come check them out. You need to check them back in so that you can reduce the opportunities for accidents and things like that, because and so there are other ways of having those controls in there. If you want to be really conservative about them, really careful, I would propose, though, having some trust with your staff and having appropriate follow-up if they alleviate them and you're not treating them like adults.
Someone asked what was the app you were referring to, or the vendor that provides that service? Both in reference to, I think both in reference to the credit cards.
Okay. Yeah.
People can unmute also and ask questions, but happy to read if people prefer the chat.
Okay. So the answer to that is the system that I like is Divvy. That's the one that has all those things under one roof, and somehow they're able to run their business off of just the credit card fees that they charge to the vendors. And so they're able to give you unlimited credit cards and a good interface, and get you, what was it, the expense reporting tool. Like, yeah, if you want to go with Expensify, you're going to be paying like 10 bucks a head per month to use something like Expensify, or you can get it through Divvy for free. And so if anybody is interested in Divvy, I can actually connect with me afterwards, because I know a salesperson there who's going to be low pressure. They're not going to twist your arms, and they will actually buy you lunch. You do a 30-minute demo with them, and they will give you a $20 virtual Divvy card. So you can actually have the experience of what's it like to use Divvy. You can play with the back end and see how it all works, and test drive it for yourself before you go any further. So just let me know. I'll be happy to connect you to that person.
Someone asked, we've had a lot of issues where outsourcing sucks up a lot of time of onboarding the contractors to how our org does things, and fixes their errors. Any tips on how to efficiently bring in new people in?
Okay, you know, Lauren, there's enough background noise that I did not hear that. There, I found this one. We've had a lot of issues where outsourcing sucks up a lot of time with onboarding the contractors. Yeah. Here are my thoughts for Jamie and anybody else. Like, yeah, that can be, and so certainly, like, and I think this would hold true for volunteers as well. Like, sometimes you don't want to be in a situation where you're taking 5 hours to train somebody to do 4 hours worth of work, right? And so there are certain functions where your time investment is going to be a whole lot better than it isn't than continuing to do it yourself. And so, you know, bookkeeping, if you're having trouble where the outsourcing to the bookkeeper is sucking up a crazy amount of time, certainly talk to that vendor about it first, but it might be that they're not the right vendor for you. If something like an ongoing service like bookkeeping, if they're not able to get up to speed quickly, or something like managed IT, it's going to take a certain amount of time. Your vendor is going to need a certain amount of time to get up to speed. But similarly, if you feel like you're holding their hands, then that might be time to change them. Another thing that can help is certainly, and I don't have any idea of whether or not you did this or didn't. So just speaking generally, you know, reference checks on the front end are really important. And so talking to people who have worked with this vendor, preferably organizations, if they have references that are similarly sized organizations, so you can really like ask the references that question, like, how much time are you spending every month with this vendor? Are they getting up to speed and quickly, or do they need tons of handholding? But then, yeah, ultimately, like, breaking up if it's not working out, and sometimes it doesn't work out. And the nice thing about working with a third party is usually it's a lot easier emotionally and otherwise to break up with a contractor than it is with an employee. Not always, but as a general rule.
I don't see any other questions in the chat, but if anyone has any lingering ones or wants to unmute and ask anything, feel free. And I'm also sending out the slides, so you'll have Sean's contact information when you get those, as well as the survey. And the recording might take a little bit longer, but I have that as well. So if no one has anything else, Sean, thank you so much. Do you have any sort of last thoughts or tips for the group?
Do we have time for another quick story?
Sure.
Great. So let me share this quick story. This is another one of those, sometimes you don't even know what's broken until somebody else takes a look at it. So literally the day before we shut down for the pandemic last year, I was having coffee with a nonprofit leader here. And he was telling me about his first day on the job at this organization that he got to be executive director of. And so he's, he goes in and he's talking to the staff and getting to meet people and asking about this, that, and the other, like, tell me about how this and that and the other, how these things work. And so he asked somebody, hey, tell me about that rusty van I see out in the parking lot. It looks like it hasn't moved for a while. And so they tell him, yeah, that's our van. We used to use it for deliveries and this, that, and the other. But, it broke down a couple of years ago. And So like, well, what's going on with that? Yeah, well, nothing, and come to find out, he dug a little deeper. Not only were they taking up a parking space with this old rusty van that they weren't using anymore, they were still paying insurance on this old rusty van that they weren't using anymore. And this had been going on for at least 2 years before the new executive director got there. There was no good reason to be paying insurance on a vehicle that couldn't move. But the organization, the staff were either so in deep or whatever, but people just had stopped thinking about it. It probably got put off for a couple of months. But you get used to these things, just like sometimes, we get used to having a pain in our side or whatever, and we just start to think that's normal. And pretty soon we forget that you're not supposed to be paying insurance on a rusty old van on the parking lot. And so, whether or not you get like a paid contractor to come help you out, or just, get a trusted friend from another nonprofit, get a peer to come like do a walk around with you and ask you some tough questions, somebody who you trust to ask tough questions and, point out weird stuff. Like, tell me about this van. There's another nonprofit leader I was talking to, similar kind of situation. And he got brought in on interim basis to this organization, and come to find out their landlord was, thinking about kicking them out because the landlord needed more space. They were getting a sweetheart deal on rent, and landlord needed some more space. And so all of a sudden, they're not just having to be the interim executive director, they're about to get kicked out and have to deal with all the mess that comes with losing your space. And so he starts asking staff and the board, like, hey, I haven't seen anybody going in and out of this room where we have all these files. Does anybody know about that? Come to find out, for years and years and years, they'd been paying rent on a room that they'd just been using to store a bunch of really, really, really old files. And so they went through them in like over the course of a day. They shredded and destroyed and scanned everything that they still needed. And they were able to get their landlord off their back, because the landlord, they really just needed one room, right? And so they were able to give this big room back to the landlord. They didn't have to move. They were able to save close to $5,000 a year because they didn't have to pay rent on that room anymore. And they didn't have all the moving expense. And it was just because somebody new came into the organization and said, do we really need to be doing this anymore? They saved money and they didn't have to move. So getting a fresh set of eyes on things can make a big, big difference. That's the end of my stories for now, unless somebody else wants one.
No, that was great. Well, thank you for everything, Sean. We really appreciate having you. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.
Thanks, everybody.